Well, welcome back, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 WFO conference if you are just joining us. We've been having a great set of programs today, and I'm delighted to introduce our first workshop presenter of the conference, Nathan Pieplow. Most people who have come to Western Field Ornithologist conferences are familiar with Nathan through his popular Sound ID Challenge program and his workshops and field trips during the conference. Nathan has recently published the Peterson Field Guide to Identifying Bird Sounds. First, the Eastern edition that came out in 2017, and then more recently, the Western edition. Thank you, Nathan. Nathan became interested in birding and bird sounds as a youth in eastern South Dakota, a venue that we both share. In fact, Nathan and I graduated from the same high school, Lincoln Senior High School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, although in very different years. Go Patriots. Nathan is also the founder of the earbirding blog, earbirding.com, and that's a very interesting site to visit if you haven't already done so. Nathan is teaching at the University of Colorado in Boulder and is very active in Colorado Field Ornithologist and has been the editor of the journal Colorado Birds. So with that, I turn you over to Nathan for his workshop, A Shared Vocabulary for Bird Sounds. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you so much, John. We must have talked about this in the past, but I had completely forgotten that you were from Sioux Falls and that we went to the same high school. That's fantastic. I'm going to share my screen and share my sound here. And hopefully you can now see my title slide with my wonderful illustrations by WFO member Bryce Robinson, WFO board member Bryce Robinson. During tonight's presentation, I might ask you some questions. And if I ask you some questions, because I'm used to doing this in an interactive format, in person, feel free to answer those questions via the chat. When I ask questions and we get interactive, that just helps. It helps you guys kind of focus and learn, and it helps keep us kind of on our toes instead of zoning out. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to hit the Q&A button. So either at the bottom or at the top of your Zoom screen, you should see a little black bar. If you have it kind of full screen, you might have to mouse over the top or the bottom of your screen to see the little black bar of Zoom controls. One of them says chat and another one says Q&A. So the Q&A is for questions that you may have. And I'll try to monitor that, and hopefully Jan and some others can monitor that as well. And then chat is for answering questions that I might ask during the presentation. Some of you may have seen versions of this talk before. I've given it a number of times, including at WFO, but I'm gonna keep giving it until we are all on the same page, which we still aren't. I want to make sure that we are, I'm gonna go back to that title slide for a second. I wanna make sure that when we talk about bird sounds, we are all using the same words to describe them. That is one of my life goals. If I have any impact on the birding world, in quotation marks, I hope this could be it. We already have a shared vocabulary to talk about how birds look. For example, we all agree on the names of the parts of a bird. We actually have to learn this vocabulary when we start birding. Every field guide has a page that looks kind of like this near the start, where they actually list the different parts of a bird so that if you don't know what they're called, you can learn what they're called. We all agree on the names of the colors. We have a very well-established vocabulary for what the colors are. We all agree on those names. And we agree on the names of the visual patterns. We all agree, for example, on the difference between a spot and a stripe, or what barring is. So there's no reason that we can't do the same thing for sounds. It's just that we haven't yet. We haven't all sat down and agreed on what words we're going to use to describe sounds. So my goal tonight, in this kind of lightning fast presentation where I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, is to hopefully get us all using the same words to describe what we hear. So let's start off with talking about the parts of a sound, the things that we're going to talk about. Every once in a while, during this talk, I will play a bird sound, and you may see the shape of the bird sound on your computer screen. Maybe it'll appear as the bird sings. That is the spectrogram. So we just heard this thick-billed fox sparrow sing, and his spectrogram appeared across the top of the screen as he was singing. Just out of curiosity, I'm curious because I know that when I've given this same presentation over Zoom a couple times before, there was a lag for some people between the audio and the video and the visual. They should be linked, but some people, sometimes I would press play and the bird would sing on my computer, and then like a minute, like 3 or 4 seconds later, it would play on other people's computers. So I don't want to talk over the birds. I'll try to give them some space in case there's a lag. If you're noticing a lag, or if you're noticing that I'm talking over the birds, or that things are not syncing up, just drop a note in the chat, and then we can go from there. Also, you can adjust your volume as necessary. We'll go back once here, and I'll just play this fox sparrow one more time, just for the sake of a test. And hopefully you can hear that and see it. So this fox sparrow has shared his song with us, and it can help us learn the parts of a sound. One thing that you should be listening for and describing whenever you hear a bird sound and want to describe it is the number of notes. And this is something very quantitative that we can be very precise about. Sometimes you might hear a bird sound and there might be too many notes for you to count. That's fine. All you need to do is say that. If you say that, you have given us valuable information. If there are few enough that you can actually count them, then be precise about that if you can. And that's also very valuable information. So on that spectrogram there, you can see how many notes there are. If you actually have a picture of the sound, you can see how many notes there are, you can count them. Or if you just are listening to it, you can approximate that by ear. Another very important thing that I want you to listen to is the pattern of repetition. In other words, does the bird ever say the same thing twice in a row, or more than twice in a row? If you look carefully at that spectrogram of the thick-billed fox sparrow song, you'll notice that there are 4 different times in that song where the bird repeats the same note twice in a row. All the other notes are single. This is valuable information, and this is something that you can learn to listen to. You may not have noticed this when that fox sparrow was singing super fast, but with practice, you can start to hear when the bird repeats itself, and that's valuable information as well. And again, the spectrogram makes it easy to see that too. The third thing that I want you to pay attention to is the speed of the sound. Now, if you want to get super precise, you can. You can get out your stopwatch and you can count the number of notes per second. That's great. That's very valuable information. But you don't have to be super precise about it. I like to use the words fast and slow. And the dividing line that I draw between fast and slow is this. Fast means it's too fast for you to count the individual notes. Slow means it's slow enough that you can count the individual notes. Now, that's not a precise line. It's going to vary in different situations and for different people, but it's usually somewhere around 8 to 10 notes per second is the dividing line. Slower than 8 to 10 notes per second, you should be able to count every note in the song. Faster than 8 to 10 notes per second, most people are going to lose track. So roughly in that area, is going to be the transition between fast and slow. And if it's right on the edge, tell us that, because that's going to tell us pretty much how fast that sound is. You'll notice on the spectrogram that slower notes are farther apart horizontally, and faster parts of the song are closer together horizontally, which makes sense because time moves at an even speed on the spectrogram from left to right. Pitch pattern is the other thing that I would like you to pay attention to. We don't have to worry too much about the exact pitch that a bird is singing. You don't have to say that it's singing an A sharp or a B flat. What you might want to say is whether the pitch is staying the same from the beginning of the sound to the end, or whether it's rising or falling, or doing some combination of those. You'll notice that we can talk about the rising pattern of a whole song if each note is slightly higher than the last. We can also talk about the pitch pattern of individual notes. So you could have, for example, a falling series of rising notes where the notes themselves are rising, but the whole series is falling. In fact, canyon wrens often sound like that, for example. So think about the pitch pattern of the whole song, but also think about the pitch pattern of the individual notes. And all we're really paying attention to is whether it's going up in pitch, whether it's coming down in pitch, or whether it's staying the same in pitch. And things that stay the same in pitch look horizontal on the spectrogram because of the same pitch from left to right. Things that rise go up the spectrogram, and things that fall go down the spectrogram because the high notes are at the top, the low notes are at the bottom. And the last thing that we talk about when we're talking about parts of a bird sound, and the trickiest thing that causes the most confusion, is the type of notes. And the type of notes has to do with the shape that you're seeing on the spectrogram there. And we're going to talk about the different types of notes in more detail. That's where we're going to spend actually most of our time in this presentation today. But the different types of notes here in this one song include a trill at the end, various whistles, and a little bit of nasal stuff right there in those second and third to last notes or so. I see, so we've got these 5 things. We're going to talk about each of them in more detail, but these are the 5 parts of a bird sound: number of notes, repetition, speed, pitch pattern, and type of note. Before we move on to talk in more detail about each of these things, I see we have a question in the chat. John Dunn asks, is spectrogram now the widely used term rather than sonogram? Is sonogram still acceptable? Many of you who remember the old days, back in the what I like to call the golden era of field guides, when we had the old golden guide, they published spectrograms of birds, but they called them sonograms. You can call them sonograms, but just be aware that sonogram has a capital S, and it's a trademark of the K Elemetrics Corporation. They were the ones who originally created the sonogram, the sonograph, which then created sonograms. And so all sonograms are spectrograms, but not all spectrograms are sonograms. So I like to use the word spectrogram because it's more general and it covers all the digital stuff that we create nowadays on our computers. And Barbara asks if I can play the fox sparrow one more time now that we've been introduced to these 5 items. I can. I'll go back. I'll have to run us back real quick through those. And here's the fox sparrow one more time. And now we're zooming back through. And now we're going to talk about these 5 things in a little bit more detail and some of the words we can use to describe them. There we go. So I'm going to introduce 4 very useful terms that I would like to get everybody familiar with and using. And they are the 4 terms we can use to describe variation in repetition and speed. So let's say we have a song in which all the notes are the same and they are slow enough for you to count them. I like to call that kind of song a series. A series is when you have the same note repeated over and over again, slow enough to count. Here's an example. That was a red-shouldered hawk. And the fact that that red-shouldered hawk was singing the same note over and over again in series is actually a really good identification mark for that species in and of itself, because very few other hawks in North America sing or call in series. Most buteos, for example, just give a single scream instead of a series. The accipiters give calls in series. A couple other things do, like Northern Harrier, but usually if you see a buteo and it's giving some kind of series call, then it's a red-shouldered hawk. Now, if you have the same note over and over again, and they are repeated too fast to count, we're going to call that a trill. You may not have thought of a trill as consisting of the same note repeated over and over again really fast, but that's exactly what a trill is. And so for most people, that's above about 8 to 10 notes per second. Here's an example. That is the same exact note repeated over and over again, too fast to count, so that it kind of runs together into one trilled note for us. So same note over and over again, slow enough to count, that's a series. Same note over and over again, too fast to count, that's a trill. What if we have all different notes that are slow enough that you can count them? We're going to call that a phrase. Here's an example of a phrase. And that was a phrase from an eastern meadowlark. I'll play it one more time. You can sit there and count. Do, 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 do. That's 6 notes in that eastern meadowlark song, and each of them is on a different pitch, has a slightly different shape on the spectrogram. Phrases by themselves are kind of rare among North American bird songs. If you heard a phrase and nothing more, you probably heard an oriole or a meadowlark, because not too many other birds sing in phrases. There's lots of things that sing in trills or series, for example, but phrases are kind of rare. What if you have all different notes and they're coming at you too fast to count? We call that a warble. And an important thing to know about warbles is that warblers do not warble. In North America, there is not a single species of warbler that sings a warbling song. Warblers generally sing series or trills or some combination of series or trills, rarely something different. But warblers do not warble. However, the aptly named warbling vireo does warble, and so does this species, for example. Just to check and see if you're paying attention, I'm gonna ask you, if you recognize that bird song, to type the name of the bird song in the chat. Type the name of the species in the chat. Quick little quiz. Not graded. If you don't feel like participating, you don't have to. And you can feel free to send it just to the hosts and panelists if you want to keep it anonymous, or you can send it to everyone. And I'm seeing most people in agreement that that was a house finch. Let's play it one more time. A classic warbling song. These 4 terms, series, phrase, trill, and warble, with some combination of single notes, those 4 words plus single notes can be used to describe any bird sound. They can describe the pattern in repetition and speed of any bird sound. If you can simply tell me whether it's a series, a phrase, a trill, or a warble, or some combination of those, you will have told me a great deal about the bird sound you were listening to. In fact, in many cases, I might, if you told me that you heard, for example, a couple of single notes and then a trill, that right there is a common pattern among North American birds, but it narrows it down greatly. It narrows it down nationwide to maybe 10 or 12 species. And depending on where you were and when, it probably narrows it down to more like 4 or 5 species. And if you give me the habitat, I might even be able to tell you your bird, or at least get it down to 2 or 3 just from the pattern. So this is an incredibly powerful set of 4 words. And if you can wrap your head around it and really start to use these consistently, then we can all make great strides forward in describing what we're hearing. And John Dunn in the Q&A wants me to notice, wants me to share that our North American warblers do not warble, but old world warblers, some of the birds called warblers in the old world do warble, do have warbling songs. And we have a question in the chat, which bird gave the trill song? I actually think, I forget what bird I put in as the triller on that slide. I think it was a juvenile northern pygmy owl, which sounds a lot like a chipping sparrow. So beware next time you're in the ponderosa forest in late summer. I'm going to introduce a couple of quick terms for pitch pattern, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about types of notes, which is where most of the complexity is. Pitch patterns are generally pretty simple. We're going to use the word monotone if the pitch is the same at the beginning and the end of the sound, and that's a horizontal line on the spectrogram. We can talk about upslurred sounds or rising sounds for those that are higher at the end, downslurred sounds or falling sounds for those that are lower at the end. And then I like to use 2 other terms, which I did invent. And I've tried for the most part not to invent terminology. I'm trying merely to define the terminology that most people already use and define it precisely. However, I like to talk about overslurred sounds and underslurred sounds. Overslurred sounds are those that are highest in pitch in the middle of the sound. So they're lower at the beginning and the end. Underslurred is the opposite. It's lowest in the middle. It's useful to use these 2 terms because overslurred sounds are extremely common in the bird world. There's an awful lot of things that sing overslurred sounds. Underslurred sounds are fairly rare, at least in North America. If you tell me you heard an underslurred whistle, I'll tell you, you probably heard a black-bellied plover, because that is one of the very few birds that commonly calls with an underslurred whistle. But overslurred sounds are very common. So I do tend to use that. If you don't feel like using that terminology, you don't have to. And now we come to the part that is trickiest for most people, listening to the actual type of note, what you might call the tone quality of the note. And birds can sing with all sorts of different voices, but all of those voices, if you actually start analyzing what makes up the different sounds that we hear, the different kind of qualities that we hear in bird sounds, you can boil them down to 6 basic types of notes. Some of these can combine. Some of them, as you will hear over the next couple minutes, are extremely broad categories. So for example, whistle covers an awful lot of different kinds of sounds. But if we can start to talk about these 6 basic tone qualities, we'll be in much better shape. Let's see, Lena asks, in what page in my book do I explain over and underslurs? If you're looking at the Western Field Guide, it's going to be somewhere in those early pages. I think it's on page 7 of the Western Guide. John Dunn asks, is Eastern Wood Pewee an underslurred song? It is indeed. Pewee, it is lowest in the middle. Absolutely. And in fact, you can tell that from the spelling of peewee, but that's another story that I'll not get to right now. You can read all about that in my book too, later on pages 24 and 25 in the Western Guide. So let's talk about the 6 basic types of notes. The most common type of bird sound is a whistle. Most bird sounds, especially by small birds, are whistled. These are the same kinds of sounds that you make when you put your lips together and blow. They are also the same kinds of sounds that come out of a flute or a piccolo. They're the simple non-vertical lines on the spectrogram like this. That's just a whistled song call in that case. That's the overstirred whistle of a dusky-capped flycatcher. Overslurred means that it is highest in the middle in pitch, and underslurred means that it's lowest in the middle in pitch. So this call of dusky-capped flycatcher is highest in the middle. It might take you some practice to hear that. But that's not what I want you to concentrate on. I want you to concentrate on the fact that if you listen to that whistled sound of that dusky-capped flycatcher there, that is a sound that you could probably imitate by whistling. That's a good imitation. That's a good indication, I should say, that it is a whistled sound. Compare that with what we call a nasal sound. A nasal sound is one that's more like the human voice. The human voice is a nasal sound in and of itself. And there are some birds that when you hear them, you wouldn't imitate them by whistling. You would probably imitate them by using your voice. These are often larger birds. Whistles are typical of smaller birds. Nasal sounds are more typical of larger birds. Here's an example. That's a call from a gull. And if you listen to that gull, you can hear a difference between that and this. This one's more whistled, like you produce with your lips. And this one's more voiced, like you produce with your vocal cords. And nasal sounds are also typical of lots of other kinds of sounds. So police sirens are nasal. The buzzing of a mosquito's wings is a nasal sound. The sound of a violin is nasal. Same with the sound of an oboe. And like I said before, the human voice. And so these are typically nasal sounds versus whistled sounds. We'll see, we will go through all 6 of these in more detail here in a few minutes. Harsh sounds are those that sound really noisy. And when I say noisy, I mean they have white noise in them, like psh, really unpleasant to the ear, no apparent pitch. Here's a classic harsh sound. That's a Steller's J. So harsh sounds have that very unpleasant quality there. And Benjamin, I see your question, and we are definitely going to answer that question in a minute. We're going to see all these sounds visualized shortly. So the whistles are the ones that come from your lips more. Nasal ones are come from your voice more. And then harsh ones are these psh sounds that sound very unpleasant and unmusical. Burry or buzzy sounds are kind of like trills, in that they actually contain the same note repeated over and over again, or some kind of repeated beat. They sound like electric buzzers. Those would be more the buzzy sounds. Or the burry sounds are those that sound kind of more like a referee whistle instead of just a normal whistle with your lips. Referee whistles have a little vibrating ball in the middle of them, and they create this kind of modulation in the sound that you can hear. Here's an example of a burry whistle. That's a call from a canyon wren. It's very, very brief, but if you can listen to it, you can hear that it's got this kind of harsh or burry trilled quality to it that's different from just whistling straight up with your lips. So here's that burry sound again. And here's the regular whistle again. The regular whistle is very smooth, whereas that burry sound has kind of that referee whistle trill to it. Again, we'll hear some more examples in a second. Taps, snaps, and ticks are the types of sounds that a lot of birds would make by, say, tapping their bill on a tree, or snapping their mandibles together, or clicking their wings together, snapping their wings together. But some birds can also make sounds of this type vocally. They can make them with their vocal tract. For example, this. It's not the greatest recording in the world, but I hope you can hear that little kind of tick, which is the call of a violet-crowned hummingbird. And the final sound type that we're going to talk about today is also the most complex one. It is the polyphonic sound. If you are unaware of it, all birds have two voices. You and I have only one voice each. We can only sing one note at a time, under most circumstances anyway. But birds have two voices apiece. The vocal organ of birds is very different from the vocal organ of humans. You and I have a larynx. It's located up here in our throat, whereas birds have what's called a syrinx, and it's located farther down in the chest at the wide junction where the trachea splits into two bronchi, one to go to each lung. Birds have a sound-producing membrane in each bronchus. So they literally have two voices, one controlled by each lung. All birds have this anatomy. Relatively few birds actually use their anatomy to sing two notes at the same time. What a lot of birds do is that they use only one of those sound-producing membranes from one lung their entire lives, and they never use the other one. What some birds do is that they use one side of their syrinx for all the high notes in their song, and another side for all the low notes in their song. A few birds actually sing duets with themselves, or they sing in harmony with themselves. They produce sound from both of those syrinxes, both of those sound-producing membranes in the syrinx at the same time. And that creates a very distinctive sound that we call a polyphonic sound. With practice, you can actually learn to hear when a bird is using both sides of its syrinx simultaneously. It's not a very common thing among most North American birds. You are usually going to hear it from three families. You're going to hear it from the thrushes, the finches, and the icterids. The icterids being the family that contains the meadowlarks, the bobolink, the orioles, the blackbirds. Those three families really are fond of polyphonic sounds. Occasionally, some other birds will do it too, like Western blue-gray gnatcatchers, for example, or for that matter, Eastern blue-gray gnatcatchers. But polyphonic sounds take some practice in order to be able to recognize. I see a question in the Q&A from Benjamin asking, are mechanical sounds produced by feathers considered snap sounds like taps, snaps, or ticks? In most cases, yes, especially in North America, but there are other kinds of mechanical sounds produced by feathers that are very different. So for example, Anna's hummingbird in a dive display makes a chirping sound at the bottom of its dive that is made by the tail feathers. So that is a mechanical sound, but it's quite musical, and most people would call it whistled. And the winnowing of a snipe, that's also a mechanical sound produced by feathers, but not a tap, snap, or tick, for example. So many mechanical sounds produced by feathers are in the tap, snap, tick category, but not all. John Dunn asks, so is Alticola American Pipit song polyphonic? I'm not familiar with Alticola. Is that the alpine subspecies? I'm not familiar with the subspecies there. The American Pipit songs that I am familiar with are not polyphonic. They're merely complex and burry, typically. The ones that sing up here above treeline in Colorado are typically not polyphonic. Sprague's pipit has a polyphonic song, however. It has that very veery-like kind of ethereal quality because it is singing with both sides of its syrinx at once. Bob asks, do the Mimidae also produce polyphonic sounds? The mockingbirds, thrashers, the catbird, they absolutely can, especially when they're imitating other birds, but their own sounds tend not to be particularly polyphonic, usually. But the mimids will toss all 6 of these types of notes into one song without blinking an eye. So they will do it all. And Susan asks, is Lincoln's sparrow polyphonic? I believe the answer is no, but I might have to double check in my book to look at the spectrogram and confirm my suspicion. I think it's just burry, but I'd have to double check. We can look at that later. All right, so let's look at these 6 sound types. I forgot I was going to have to fast forward through all 6 of those in order to get us to the next page. It's a hazard, an occasional hazard here. All right. And let's go on to whistles. Let's talk in more detail about whistles. On the spectrogram, whistles appear as a single non-vertical line. Any kind of shape that you could trace with a pencil or pen that isn't a straight up and down vertical line is going to sound like some type of whistle on the spectrogram. Whistles are usually musical in quality. They sound pleasant to our ear. And like I said before, they're typical of small birds, although you can also hear them from larger birds sometimes. I'll take a second here because I've got a question from Lara in the chat. What would the sound of a mourning dove flying be considered? So when a mourning dove flies away from you, it does this song. You could call each note whistled, depending on how fast those notes are coming at you, because it's the same note coming at you many times in a row. You might be tempted to call that a trill. And then the fact is that usually 2 different wings are actually making a whistled sound at almost the same time, at almost the same pitch. And so if you're close enough to the bird, you might actually hear a polyphonic quality to that sound because it's coming from 2 different sound sources at the same time on almost, but usually not quite the same pitch. So that's the same thing goes for the trills of male Selasphus hummingbird wings. They have that kind of metallic polyphonic quality, and also the winnowing of snipe, which usually happens on both sides of the tail at once. So let's listen to some examples of whistles here. I'm going to ask you now to give me some information in the chat. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Before I play this sound, I want you to just look at it and tell me what we can learn from it. This is the song of a hybrid titmouse that I recorded near Dallas. I have not put labels on here, but the top of the spectrogram here is 10 kilohertz, which is where the top of a normal spectrogram is. And this distance from left to right along the bottom here, this is 2 seconds. So that gives you some indication of how fast or slow this sound is. First question for you. How many notes does this hybrid titmouse sing? You can type your answer in the chat. And I see everybody getting it right. 5 notes. Each individual note, what's the pitch pattern of the individual notes? Are the individual notes upslurred, downslurred, or monotone? Again, everybody's getting it right. The individual notes are downslurred, but the series, is it monotone, upslurred, or downslurred? The entire song. We have not had a single wrong answer yet. What we're seeing here is a monotone series of downslurred whistles. The series doesn't change in pitch because all the notes start and end at the same pitch. They're the same note repeated 5 times over at even intervals, but each individual note is downslurred. So we can call this a monotone series of down-slurred whistles. I'll play it for you. Normally, if we were in person, I would ask all of you now to attempt to imitate this song before you heard it, and the room would fill with titmice. You can do that at home if you want. You can try to imitate the sound before you hear it, but I'll play it for you now. I'll play it a couple times. 5 down-slurred whistles in a monotone series. Now, you may have had a little bit of trouble hearing that each note is down-slurred. That's something that comes with practice. So if you listen more frequently, you will start to catch on, especially if you listen to sounds and also look at their spectrograms at the same time, which eBird makes easy nowadays. Then that will really help for you to start to be able to hear when something is down-slurred or up-slurred or monotone, those individual notes, because they go fast. So if you're having trouble hearing that, don't worry too much. That will come with practice. But this is what the monotone series of down-slurred whistles sounds like. Here's a song that is familiar to many. I'm going to ask you a question first. How many notes is this black-capped chickadee singing? You can put your answer in the chat. And now, for the first time, we have disagreement. Some people say 2, some people say 3, some people say 2 or 3, and of course, Ted Floyd took the average and said 2.5. This totally depends on whether you consider this second note to be 1 or 2, whether you consider that little hiccup in the middle to be a break between notes or not. It doesn't really matter. That's a little hiccup that's going to be subtle to the ear. You can tell that it's going to be subtle to the ear because it's subtle to the eye. Some people hear 2 notes, in which case they think this song sounds like Phoebe. And some people hear 3 notes, in which case they say this song sounds like, hey, sweetie. It doesn't really matter which one you hear, but just be aware that there may be some disagreement, but you can see why there's disagreement by looking at the spectrogram. There's a little hiccup there. Some people could interpret that as 3 notes. Some people could interpret it as 2 notes. Now, of all those notes, which one is the highest in pitch? That's right, it's the first one. The individual notes of this song, what is their pitch pattern? Are they monotone, up-slurred, or down-slurred? This one's interesting because here we have some disagreement. A lot of people are saying monotone, some people are saying down-slurred. You can see a very slight down-slur in that first note. These second 2 are almost completely monotone. There's a little tiny bit of a down-slur there, but that's going to be flat enough that you're probably not going to hear that as anything other than monotone. So if it's flat or pretty darn close, we're going to call it monotone. So the individual notes are monotone, but you'll notice that there's a down-slurred pattern to the entire phrase because those 2 notes, the first note is higher than the second note or the second 2 notes. So here's what the black-capped chickadee sounds like. And you can kind of hear how that second note could be heard as 1 syllable or 2 syllables. So you can call it what you like, Phoebe or hey, sweetie, or whatever you want. All right, here one more time. Now, I'm going to switch from one chickadee to another. How many notes is this mountain chickadee singing? Everybody's nailing it. 6 notes. Notice that there's a difference between the first 3 notes and the last 3 notes. Are the first 3 notes faster or slower than the last 3 notes? The first 3 notes are faster or slower? That's right, they're faster. And that's because they are closer together horizontally on the spectrogram. The pitch pattern of the entire song is monotone, upslurred, or downslurred. We have an entire set of superstars here. The pitch pattern of the entire song is monotone. You may see some very slight differences. They're not going to be big enough for your ear to pick up. You might notice that each of these first three notes is actually upslurred, but they're going to be so brief, a tiny fraction of a second each, you're not going to hear that difference. So it's all going to kind of sound just like 6 notes on the same pitch. Now, when I play this song, I don't know why, but when I play it in PowerPoint, it often gets cut off at the end. And it's probably because of my sample rate or something, but so you may only hear 5 notes, but there are actually 6 notes in the recording. I'm going to play it for you here. Yeah, it only gave me 5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It actually should say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Dee, 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 dee. But it doesn't do that usually. Sometimes it does. I'm not sure why. I'm going to go back one quick second. There's the black-capped chickadee song. Here's the mountain chickadee song. There's the black-capped again. And here's the mountain. Which of those 2 species sings a higher song? Black-capped, mountain. Black-capped, mountain. Most of you are getting it right. It's not a whole lot higher, but you can actually see when I actually fade from one to the other, you can see that the whole song of mountain chickadee is actually at a higher pitch than the highest note of black-capped chickadee's song. So this is a useful thing for you to be able to tell just by looking at the spectrogram. Again, it's subtle. And of course, not all mountain chickadees sound like this across their range. This is what most mountain chickadees tend to sound like in northern Colorado. Quite a bit different from what they sound like in other parts of their range. Here's the most common call of the version of curve-billed thrasher that you get in western and central Arizona, called Palmer's curve-billed thrasher. Now, you can kind of see these kind of faint notes above the 2 notes. We're going to ignore those for right now and just focus on the dark parts. How many notes are there in this call? That's right, there are 2. And the pitch pattern of each individual note is what? Is each individual note upslurred, monotone, or downslurred? Upslurred, fantastic. And how would you describe the difference between those 2 notes? What do you notice about the difference between those 2 notes? This might take you a little bit longer to type out. I'm seeing a variety of answers here, but they all boil down to the same thing. These 2 notes are both upslurred. They both start at the same pitch, but the second one continues much higher up the scale than the first one does. It also lasts a little bit longer in time, although that might be a little tricky to notice. Here's that call. And you can see why we call it wit-weet. And you can actually, when you listen to it and look at it, you can actually see what you're hearing, and you can hear what you're seeing. You can hear that both of those are upslurred sounds that start low and end high, and that the second one goes up much higher than the first one, which is one of the reasons why I like to practice on this sound. All right. Here is a slightly more complicated song. We're gonna get a little bit more complicated as we go. This is a song of a common yellowthroat. And let me just ask, if you were taught a mnemonic device or a description of the common yellowthroat song, what were you taught that the common yellowthroat says? And I'm seeing the same thing over and over again. Witchety, witchety, witchety. I don't know where that came from. It probably came from Peterson. That's where most of these things came from. And Maureen correctly notes that Western ones are less likely to say witchety, witchety. There's more variation in the West, although you can get non-witchety yellowthroats anywhere. But witchety, witchety, witchety is a 3-syllable note, a 3-syllable word repeated. And you can see that structure in this spectrogram. Notice that we've got a lot of stuff going on here, but there's this first note, we'll call that A. Here's this second note, we'll call that B. And this third note, we'll call it C. Well, here's A again, here's B again, here's C again. And again, A, B, C, A. It's A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, A. Is the pattern that we're seeing of repetition here. And when you're listening to these notes, these are whistled notes, you'll notice there's a whole lot of complexity going on, especially in the second one. Looks like a lightning bolt coming down here. Your ear is not going to hear all the pitch details there. It's just going to basically sound like a note. It's going to go by too fast for you to hear all that variation in pitch. But you are going to hear that these 3 notes are different. And then you're going to hear that the same 3 notes are repeated, and then the same 3 notes, and then partway through the third series. And so what we've got here is we've got a 3-note phrase. Remember that phrase is the word we use when there are 3 different notes that are slow enough to count. And then we have the same 3-note phrase repeated, and then the same 3-note phrase repeated. And so what we actually have here is we have a series of phrases. We have a monotone series of 3-note phrases. A 3-note phrase can be called a triplet, just as a 2-note phrase could be called a couplet. A 4-note phrase could be called a quadruplet. So if this is a series of triplets, we could also call it a triplet series. In other words, it sounds like the bird is repeating a 3-syllable word. I'll play it for you here. That's this particular yellowthroat. There's your witchety, witchety, witchety. Complex phrases of this type, like triplet phrases, are actually not that common in North America, particularly in the Western United States. If you tell me that you were in the West and you heard a triplet phrase, we can usually narrow it down straight to common yellowthroat. There's not a whole lot else that sings triplet phrases, except for oak and juniper titmice in the West. In the East, there's a few more things that sing like this: Carolina wrens, the occasional cardinal, etc. But just by describing the pattern, we can actually narrow these bird sounds down pretty well. So I wanted to introduce to you the notion of a complex phrase where a set of notes that are different becomes the element that is repeated in series. And Ted here in the chat has given us a variety of different ways to describe how the common yellowthroat sounds, and I'm guessing that he has given us this as the origin of witchety, witchety. Here's a slightly more complex song. As you will note, All of the notes here are different. This bird does not repeat the same note twice in a row. It's got few enough that you're probably going to be able to mostly count them, although it gets a little bit complicated toward the end, and it speeds up a little bit toward the end. You'll also notice that the pitch pattern of this song tends to come down. The actual highest point of the song is in the middle, but if you kind of look at the bottom here, you'll see this kind of downward slope. The lowest note in the song is at the end. And so it kind of starts in the middle, tends downward with a few upward jumps along the way, tends to speed up as it goes. Sometimes it actually ends in a gurgle or a warble. But this is your classic Western meadowlark song here. I'll play it a couple times, and I just encourage you to try to match what you're seeing with what you're hearing. Try to follow each note through the spectrogram as you're listening. Remind me in the chat what it's called when all the notes are different in a song and they are slow enough for you to count. All the notes different, slow enough to count. What do we call that? We call that a phrase. Excellent. Thank you so much. What do you call it when all the notes are different and they're coming at you too fast to count? That's right, it's a warble. And here's a classic warbled song from our friend the pine grosbeak. Possibly those last two notes are the same, but you're probably not even going to pick up on that. Because everything else in there is coming at you too fast to count, and all of them are different. So this is another classic warbled song. That's kind of what a warble looks like on the spectrogram right there. Now, I told you earlier that whistles can sound a lot of different ways. If we define a whistle as a single non-vertical line on the spectrogram, then we have to recognize that those really low-pitched hoots of owls and the coos of doves are actually really just low-pitched whistles. And whistles change in tone quality quite significantly from the bottom of the spectrogram to the top. So I'm going to play you these four sounds. Hopefully they'll kind of be played in sync with the highlighting of each spectrogram here. Listen to how the tone quality changes from low to high as we go from the lowest whistle to the highest whistle here. Was that in time? Were you hearing the right bird at when each spectrogram was highlighted, or was there a lag? I love that it sounds like it was perfect for Ted anyway. I'm going to play it again here. So if you think about it, a really low pitched whistle it sounds like blowing over the top of a large bottle. And that's what owls and doves sound like. And those really are just really low pitched whistles. That's all they are. And they come up gradually transitioning into these other tone qualities. When humans whistle with their lips, we are right around where this northern saw-whet owl is. We actually can't whistle as high. Most people anyway can't whistle as high as this black-capped chickadee right here. And that's not even halfway up the spectrogram. Cedar waxwings are way up there. Some of you might not even be able to hear that, depending on your upper range of your hearing. So when we whistle, we're usually down here, lower than what we would whistle. We usually call those hoots or coos. And then a lot of birds are up in this range, up where the chickadees are, or even the waxwings are. So we're going to call these all whistles. You can also use the words hoots or coos, but it's good just to recognize that we can define a hoot or a coo as a really low-pitched whistle. Now, let's talk about nasal sounds. Nasal sounds look quite different on the spectrogram. You'll notice that I've drawn a whole bunch of copies, like a stack of evenly spaced whistles. That is what nasal sounds look like on the spectrogram. That is because that is exactly what nasal sounds are. Nasal sounds are a whole bunch of different whistles on different pitches being produced at the exact same time. It's kind of like a chord, but your ear interprets it as a single sound with a nasal tone quality instead of a chord. And there are reasons for that that have to do with mathematics. Those sounds are linked to one another in integer multiples of frequency and in phase. And they're being produced simultaneously by a single vibrating membrane. So that's why we interpret them as a single sound. Your voice on the spectrogram looks like this. It has all sorts of horizontal lines that are stacked up on top of one another. And a lot of bird sounds look like this as well, especially those of large birds. But not always large birds. Here's a classic nasal sound, the little tin trumpet sound of the red-breasted nuthatch. And notice that we've got a whole bunch of lines stacked on top of one another. It's like copies of the same sound stacked evenly into this high stack. That is what nasal sounds tend to look like. Here's a whole bunch of nasal notes that are extremely brief, but you'll notice that they are stacks of basically the same shape going all the way from the bottom of the spectrogram all the way to the top of the spectrogram. This is a nasal series by a Cooper's hawk. You'll hear some slight differences in pitch as the bird vocalizes, which we'll talk about in a second. But in the meantime, I would like to just remind you that when it's the same note over and over again, slow enough to count, we call that a series. So here's an example of a nasal series. And when it's the same note over and over again, too fast to count, we call that a trill. So here's a nasal trill by a red-breasted nuthatch. So you can see that we can combine these words that we've heard before into multiple, very specific descriptions of what we're hearing. Pitch affects tone quality of nasal sounds too. And we haven't yet talked about how to assess the pitch of a nasal sound. It gets complicated because it's easy to assess the pitch of a whistle because all you have to do is evaluate how far it is off the bottom of the spectrogram. If it's higher up, it's a higher sound. If it's lower down, it's a lower sound. But what if you have a sound that literally goes from the bottom to the top? How are you supposed to estimate the pitch? The best answer is to look at how far apart those horizontal stacked whistles are. If they are close together, that is a low-pitched nasal sound. If they are far apart, that is a high-pitched nasal sound. And we can talk about the reasons for that if you want to get into the weeds, but for now, I'll just say this is your nice and easy shortcut. I'll play you these 4 calls by 4 different species of gull, and they will go from low to high, and you'll notice that the whistles get farther and farther apart each time. This is a lot of fun. I'll play it a couple times. notice that by the time we get to the Bonaparte's gull, I would call that a squeaky sound. This Bonaparte's gull is squeaking. And that's actually not a coincidence. Other kinds of sounds that we call squeaky actually have this same structure. A squeaky sound we can actually define as a high-pitched nasal sound. When nasals, just like whistles turn into hoots and coos, when they get low-pitched, nasal sounds turn into squeaks when they get really high-pitched. And a lot of people are familiar with the squeaky calls of grosbeaks, black-headed grosbeak and rose-breasted grosbeak, often likened to the squeak of a gym shoe on a gym floor. The squeaky call of black-headed grosbeak looks almost exactly like this Bonaparte's gull spectrogram, except squished horizontally into a much shorter time frame. That's what makes it squeaky, is that it's a high-pitched nasal sound. Bob in the Q&A asks, are all of these gulls overslurred? And the answer is yes. And you are correct, they appear to be overslurred because you can see that they're highest in the middle, and they are. There are a few complications here. We've got a break in the middle of the laughing gull call there, that vertical fault line there, and some other stuff going on in the great black-backed gull. But yes, these are 4 overslurred nasal sounds on different pitches. And let's see, Debbie is, well, let me, I've got 2 things. Let me answer Ted's first. Ted says when he tries to trick the Merlin Bird ID app with his own voice, it often returns great black-backed gull. That's actually very helpful to note, because if you were to record your own voice on the spectrogram, it would probably look a lot like this great black-backed gull recording. That great black-backed gull, if you can listen to it, I'll play it one more time. It actually sounds like a sound that a human might make. It sounds like kind of a weird human sound, and then they become less human as they go farther to the right. But that's no coincidence. This is what our voices look like on the spectrogram. They are low-pitched nasal sounds. At least our voices are very low-pitched compared to bird voices. So here that is again. Debbie in the chat says, it seems like most of the energy of the calls increases left to right. How is that contributing to our sense of pitch versus the tightness of the stacking? Debbie, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. When you say most of the energy of the calls increases left to right, are you talking about it's greater in the great black-backed gull and less in the Bonaparte's gull? Or do you mean that it's increasing from left to right within each sound? I'm not quite sure. So if you can clarify, I can maybe help you out. Jay asks, mechanistically, morphologically, how are nasal sounds produced, and how does this relate to polyphony and to harmonics? That's getting into the weeds, but I'm happy to talk about that. So each of these sounds can be made, just like our own voices, can be made with a single vibrating membrane. Just like a single plucked string vibrates simultaneously on multiple frequencies, and that's how a guitar or a piano or a violin ends up looking like this on the spectrogram too, with multiple harmonics. It's because it's vibrating at the slowest frequency and also at 2 times that frequency, and also at 3 times and 4 times and 5 times and 6 times that frequency. Strings and membranes work that way. And so that's why bird sounds work that way. A single, one side of the syrinx, one membrane can produce all these sounds at once, but they are tied mathematically to one another. We'll talk a little bit more when we get to polyphonic sounds about what happens, how this relates to polyphony. And then Debbie says, increasing left to right with each call. So really, I'm not sure that the energy of the energy calls would be the darkness of the lines. It has more to do with the volume of the sounds than with anything else. It's not, the darkness of the lines here has to do with pitch. It has more to do with nasality than it has to do with pitch. I'm not going to get into too much detail right now. There's a little bit more detail in my book or on my blog about this if you want to go looking for it. But suffice it to say that when you see these stacks of whistles, pay attention to where the darkest one is or where the darkest ones are, because if the darkest ones are higher up, that means the sound is more nasal. It does not mean the sound is higher pitched. It means the sound is more nasal. If you get a stack of whistles like this, and the very darkest one is the bottom, that's going to sound not very nasal. It's going to sound more whistled, or maybe in between whistled and nasal, maybe a very rich, a rich whistle, kind of, you might call it. So that's the darkness of the energy, the height of the energy in these sounds has to do with how nasal it sounds. It also has to do with how loud it sounds, but it does not have to do with how high pitched it sounds. I hope that answers your question. Here's one of my all-time favorite sounds. When greater prairie chickens gather to dance on the lek, they often give these long calls, and this is a three-part complex nasal sound. You can see that the first part here consists of a single note. Then we've got this set of notes in the middle. That's the second part of the call. And then we've got this third set of notes at the end. That's the third part of the call. So tell me real quick, of these, the second part and the third part of the call, which of those is going to be the fastest? Is the second part of the call going to be faster, or is the third part of the call going to be faster? People are saying second, and they are correct. Which part of the call is going to sound lowest in pitch? First part, second part, third part. Of these second and third ones, let me ask you this. Second series and third series, which of those is going to sound lowest in pitch? The second part is going to sound lower. I should have asked which part is going to sound higher in pitch. That would be an easier one for you to pick out, right? Because this gets a little complicated because we've got these notes here have the highest part of the call in them. And you can tell because the stacked lines are farthest apart. But then you'll notice that they're overslurred, and as they come down, they get really low pitch, and these lines get really close together toward the end. So I should have asked which notes have the highest portion in them. What's the highest portion of the call? That would be the third part right there. This first note, as you can probably tell, is going to be mostly rising in pitch. It's actually a little bit overslurred. You can see that it comes down there right at the end, but you can also tell that like 95% of that call is rising, and then just maybe the last, tenth of a second is falling. So it's pretty much going to sound rising. These are overslurs. These are going to sound more downslurred because more than 2/3 of the call is downslurred, and only a short bit at the start is upslurred. So you can see that they're overslurred, but the downslurred part is what's going to strike your ear. So I'm going to play this. I'm not going to make you try to imitate this, but you could, if you want, to amuse your family and friends. You could. Here's what this sounds like. And you can hear that rising long first note, this low, fast second series, and this slow, high third series. I'll play it again. Note that this second series looks a lot like what we saw for that Cooper's Hawk call, and it also is going to sound a lot like what we heard for that Cooper's Hawk call, just that second part. That's a good rule of thumb. If two things look similar on the spectrogram, they're going to sound similar to the ear. If they sound similar to the ear, they're going to look similar on the spectrogram. That's a key notion. I'll play it one more time. And when I play it again, also note that this was recorded on a greater prairie chicken lek. And so in addition to this long call, you're also hearing the displaying males. And depending on how good your computer speakers are, you may hear more or less of those low-pitched woo-loo-woo kind of hooting or cooing whistles from those displaying males. And you can also, you could see them on the spectrogram, but I don't know if you noticed this, but I cut off the bottom of this spectrogram so that the oos of the courting males in the background would not confuse you. But you can definitely still hear them. Oops, let's go back here. All right. And I think I answered your question, John, that yes, there were other prairie chickens in the background there. And your other question about modulation we'll get to when we get to burry and fuzzy sounds here. So let's talk a little bit about noisy sounds or harsh sounds. I use those two words more or less interchangeably. When I say noisy, I don't just mean that a bird is loud. I mean that it contains noise in its call, like white noise. Looks like TV static on the spectrogram, sounds like TV static to the ear. It's got that harsh quality. Here's that Steller's jay we heard earlier. That's what it actually looks like on the spectrogram. It looks about as pretty as it sounds. It looks like somebody just took kind of the charcoal from or the lead from a pencil and kind of just smeared it all over the spectrogram there. Nasal sounds typically, harsh sounds like this typically stretch all or most of the way to the top and bottom of the spectrogram, and they start and end pretty abruptly. So they tend to look rectangular, more or less, with some exceptions. What if you had a whole bunch of the exact same harsh note repeated over and over again, too fast to count? What do we call it when the same note is repeated over and over again, too fast to count? That's right, it's called a trill. Now, you might not have thought of this as a trill, but here's a trill of noisy notes or a trill of harsh notes. Now, when house wrens get angry and make a sound like this, what word would you typically use to describe that sound before you took this workshop? What would you have called that? I'm seeing a variety of sounds being described, a variety of words being described, and most people seem to be calling it chatter. That seems to be the most common answer. Quite a few people are saying rattle. Quite a few people are saying scold. To call this the scold call is to name this call for its function, not its sound. That's perfectly legitimate. You can call it the scold call. But if you're naming it for its sound, you're going to call it probably something more like a chatter or a rattle. Same if you call it, and then Claire called it machine gun. So I would have called it a chatter. And I would call something slightly different a rattle, although rattle and chatter are very similar. But we can actually use spectrograms like this to define words like chatter specifically. I like to say that a chatter is a trill of harsh notes. That's what a chatter is. Just like a squeak is a high-pitched, noisy, high-pitched nasal sound, a chatter is a trill of noisy notes. And a rattle is a trill of peak notes or pick notes, but at least in my terminology, but I'm not going to get there today. That's a little bit too into the weeds for us today. Now it's time to talk about burry and buzzy sounds. We're going to have just about exactly enough time for this, which is great. Burry and buzzy sounds are those that when you look at the line on the spectrogram, you see that it squiggles up and down really fast. That's the pitch rising and falling very, very rapidly. And it ends up striking your ear very, very much the same as a trill does. In fact, your ear usually can't tell the difference between one note that goes up and down really fast and a series of notes that have breaks in between them, but are delivered at that same speed. You usually can't tell the difference. So the same way you identify a trill, you could also call it burry and buzzy. These sounds are all very closely related. They look a little different on the spectrogram, but they're going to strike your ear very much the same. And John, to answer your question in the chat, this is what I meant by modulated. I mean that it is either burry or buzzy. It has an up and down squiggled component to it that is in some way cyclical and usually very rapid. Burry and buzzy sounds are two ends of a continuum, and burry are the ones that are more musical and buzzy are the ones that are less musical, but they grade into each other in the middle and they're all closely related. Here's a classic burry sound. You can see that it looks more or less like a whistle, but it's actually, you can see those up and down squiggles in that whistle. Looks really cool, and you're going to hear it like that referee whistle kind of trill quality to it. If you've never been lucky enough to hear this song of Montezuma quail in the wild, it's a really special sound. It's really cool. It's only very slightly downslurred on this spectrogram, but you're going to hear it pretty distinctly because the song is so long and it gives you time to hear that pitch difference there. It's also low, which accentuates it. Here's what it sounds like. A wonderful sound. And you can actually hear those up and down squiggles as that kind of slightly rough, trilled quality, referee whistle quality to this. But you know this is going to be burry instead of buzzy because those squiggles are far enough apart you can see them individually on the spectrogram, and they're not very tall. So that means they're sticking very close to that original whistled line, and it's going to sound pretty musical. Here it is again. Compare that to this is a burry sound, a very musical version of the squiggles. Compare that to a buzzy sound, like the peent of common nighthawk. Now here, those squiggles are so close together that you can hardly even tell that they're actually squiggles. It looks kind of like a noisy sound or a harsh sound. If you look very carefully, you can see the vertical striation there. And also you can tell that this is a buzzy sound instead of a harsh sound or noisy sound, because it doesn't stretch all the way to the top and bottom of the spectrogram, or nearly so. It's much more defined vertically, but it's also very tall, and those squiggles are really fast. In fact, the up and down squiggles here are happening 120 times per second in the common nighthawk peent. That means it still has that buzzy quality, but it's going to be much less musical than what we just heard. It's going to be kind of at the other end of that burry buzzy spectrum, much less musical, more harsh. And you can see here that even though it's one note or one single sound, you can see that it kind of has two syllables. The second half of it is a little bit lower. You can see that dark band coming down. You can see the shape of the sound changing down there. And you can hear that too, if you listen carefully. It has this vaguely two-syllabled sound to it. And you can see that on the spectrogram. I'm going to play you a Scott's Oriole song here. This is a delightful little phrase. For the most part, it's a phrase. You'll notice that it has two burry notes. mixed in with all the rest whistles. A lot of times birds won't just sing one note type, they will mix and match in their songs. And so it gets complicated to follow along and hear the different tone qualities and how they mix together in adjacent notes. I'm going to play this a couple times. We're not going to spend too much time on it. It's a little complicated, but see if you can listen for that one burry note that then gets repeated right at the end. All the rest of these are going to be whistles here. And if you can hear it, it has a slightly different tone quality in that note. You may have noticed that this Scots oriole has a phrase at the start of its song that it repeats at the end of its song. And that's typical of Scots oriole. In fact, if you tell me that the bird sings a complicated phrase where the end recapitulates the beginning, if you're anywhere in the Southwest, it's probably a Scots oriole, could be a sagebrush sparrow. They do that sometimes too. But not very many birds do that. The only other North American birds that regularly do that are the longspurs. Well, actually just Lapland longspur and snow bunting. So if you're able to hear that final note and then that same note earlier, it's burry. And you can tell that it's burry because it's vertically thicker than these other whistles in this song. Taps, snaps, and ticks look like a thin vertical line on the spectrogram. They could be produced by the voice, by the wings, by the bill, etc. Here's that violet-crowned hummingbird call we heard earlier. Note how it looks almost vertical on the spectrogram. And it's just a little, and it's not very loud. I will note briefly that chips, what we call chip notes of warblers, they are almost vertical and they are downslurred, but they're actually whistled sounds. Remember that a whistled sound is any non-vertical line on the spectrogram. When whistles get almost but not quite vertical and they're starting high and ending low, they turn into chip notes of warblers. So here's the chip note of an American redstart. And you can see that doesn't really sound much like a whistle. It's almost getting more toward a click. So there's a continuum between whistles, which are horizontal, and clicks, which are vertical. And chip notes are the downslurred version of a whistle that's almost but not quite a click. A whit is the same thing, but upslurred, like the whit of an Empidonax flycatcher, like this. When you're hearing the difference between a chip and a whit, you're actually hearing the difference in downslurred versus upslurred. You may not have thought of it that way before, but that's what you're hearing. In this particular case, you're also hearing a difference in slope of the line, in musicality, and also in pitch. But the difference between chip and whit is upslurred versus downslurred. This is advanced description, so you don't have to worry if you can't quite hear those differences yet. That's something that comes more with time. And since we're almost to the end of our time, I want to get us to the final type of sound, the polyphonic sounds. This is where the bird uses both of its voices at once. On the spectrogram, you can usually tell a polyphonic sound because you'll see that the lines tend to cross one another, or they stack, but they're not the same shape. They don't match in shape the way that the lines in a nasal sound do. So that's one of your clues that the bird is using both of its voices. And then there are two basic ways that a polyphonic sound can strike your ear. It can sound kind of whiny, or it can sound metallic. If you're describing a bird sound as metallic, it's probably polyphonic. If you're describing it as kind of whiny, it may well be polyphonic as well. So here's a metallic call from a hooded oriole. And you can hear that kind of metallic quality. You can tell that this is a polyphonic sound because if you look carefully, this lowest line is actually downslurred, and then some of these other lines are upslurred at the exact same time. You know that if one line is upslurred and one line is downslurred at the same time, those could not have come from the same sound source. So that has to be two different sound, voices, two different membranes in the bird's syrinx. So that metallic quality is distinctive for polyphonic sounds. Again, this comes with practice. Sometimes you just see a plate of spaghetti on the spectrogram and with lines going everywhere, crossing over each other. There's also some kind of harshness and noise in with this one. This is a classic type of call that you hear from finches. And it has that kind of whiny quality to it. Most finch calls like this that sound kind of whiny are polyphonic. You hear this whiny quality from finches all the time. It's almost always from polyphony. So those are our 6 types of notes. Whistled notes are single non-vertical lines. Nasal notes are stacks of similar lines. The radiostatic is the harsh sound. The squiggles are burry or buzzy. The vertical lines are clicks. And the plate of spaghetti is the polyphonic sounds. And we're basically out of time. So I'm not gonna, I mean, we basically got through all the content I wanted to get through. But I don't have time really to get into some of the other cool stuff that we could be talking about, like how to use your phone to actually make pictures of sounds and things like that. But we can hopefully deal with those at a later date. I don't want to keep anybody any longer than we need to, but does anybody have questions that you have not put in the Q&A yet?
Well, thank you, Nathan. That's a fascinating workshop, and I hope everybody is going to study up and be ready for Saturday night, because Saturday night is going to be the Sound ID Challenge. So I hope we'll see all of you then. We're going to take a brief break now, and then the conference will resume at 7 o'clock with Tom Hahn's talk on Cardwellian finches, and I think we're going to hear some about sound in this group of birds as well. And thank you again, Nathan, and thank you everyone for attending today and making this a successful conference. Thanks very much all, and we'll see you again soon.